Uh, Please welcome again John Lewis and also Carolina Rosero. She's from the Amazon Program Conservation International here in Ecuador. And John Lewis is going to be the chair for this plenary about setting the stage. What is at stake with biodiversity loss, and how do we enable nature-positive development pathways for sustainability challenges? So let's go, John Lewis. Thanks.
Thanks. My job as chair, given I'm development economist, right? So I mean, I'm completely out of my depth in terms of biodiversity, apart from having very carefully read the Dasgupta report, which I would urge all of you to download off the internet. It's only 600 pages, but you will become serious. I mean, but go at least the executive summary, okay? At least read that, please. You know, do me a favor, especially if you have a social science background. It's very good reading and it's very well written. So my job here is basically to keep everyone honest in terms of their time, which is complicated by the fact that we have a lot of people online, and thank you all for being here. So the panelists that we have are Vanessa around? I don't see her on the screen, but anyway, Vanessa Ushi, who's the acting director of the African Natural Resources Center at the African Development Bank. Then we've got Thomas Elmqvist, who's a professor at Stockholm University in the Natural Resource Management at the Stockholm Resilience Center. We've got Simon Levin, who's a professor at Princeton and the director of the Center for Biocomplexity at the Princeton Environmental Institute, excuse me. We were supposed to have Partha, who he was a professor of mine when I was doing an MPhil at Cambridge, but unfortunately he's severely under the weather. Partha Dasgupta, so he will not be joining us. Then we have David Cooper, who's the acting executive secretary of the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And then finally, we have Carolina, who I have the pleasure of having right next to us, the Amazon Program Director for Conservation International in Ecuador. So basically, let me just set down the ground rules. The way we're going to do this. My job, I say, is to keep you honest, and then to try to knit all of this together. So in French, I call this tricotage, something that you have to do. So what we're going to do is basically the order that I propose to do this in. Then all the panelists have been sent them an email a while ago. So we'll start with Simon, if that's agreeable for you. Followed by David, followed by Carolina, followed by Thomas, followed by Vanessa. 10 minutes each, please. And let's get started. And then what we'll do is we'll come back with questions that come out of this, and then we'll have another round with 2 minutes. And I'll try to also give some space. Given that we have I feel I'm in a movie theater, right? I feel it's like Cinema Paradiso here. You know, there should be someone projecting. It's wonderful. I love there's a good word in Portuguese to say the astral of a room. Astral sort of means the feel that you get from the room. This room has a very good feel to it. So without more ado, please, Simon, you have the floor.
Yeah, can you hear? Excuse me. Can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Oh, yes, you can hear me. Is that correct?
I can.
Yeah, okay, very good. So as an ecologist, I want to begin by asking, why should we care about biodiversity? The easy answer is that we should respect all species, the diversity within them, and the intricate relationships among them, just as we should respect even the inanimate features of our planet, like mountains and lakes. We're, after all, just one of millions of species that evolution has created, and we must share Earth with those other inhabitants. But there's a more selfish reason why we should care about biodiversity. We couldn't survive without it. Biodiversity provides a range of ecosystem services and goods, and they are essential to a sustainable future for humanity. So we have to ask, what are those services? How do they depend upon the features of ecosystems? What maintains those features? And in particular, how important is biodiversity? And how do we manage the human and environmental systems in order to sustain those services? So biodiversity provides us with food and fiber, with fuel and pharmaceuticals, those so-called provisioning services, but it also helps to sequester toxic materials. It mediates climate, it cycles nutrients that are crucial to life, call these supporting or maintenance and regulating services. And its services include also aesthetic and ethical aspects. Our respect for wilderness, for example, so-called cultural services. So are we eroding those services? Our investment, human and other capital, manufactured capital, sufficient to offset the depletion of natural capital? So Partha and I were part of a paper led by Kenneth Arrow in 2004 called "Are We Consuming Too Much?", in which we laid out a framework with a familiar present value of the utility of consumption. But the thing we took into account was the natural capital that would be eroded by different consumption patterns. And so if Partha were going to talk today, he would talk a lot about this formula, so-called inclusive wealth. It accounts for the non-market benefits, and it estimates, we estimated which countries were most dangerously exceeding the limits, depleting natural capital at unsustainable rates. So all species are important, but some are more important than others because they provide us these services directly or indirectly. For example, by sustaining the ecosystem structure and functioning. Sure, you might raise the argument that over evolutionary timescales, species come and go. Some degree of replacement's just a manifestation of natural selection at work. So why shouldn't we just let nature do its thing? Well, it's not nature doing it, it's us. The net biodiversity loss on ecological timescales is something else altogether, especially at the magnitude we're experiencing. Indeed, we're losing species at unprecedented rates due to climate change, habitat degradation, pollution, overexploitation, invasions by alien species, and a bunch of other factors. Observations of losses of vertebrate species have been, so when we took the intermission, I was saying that we're losing species at unprecedented rates due to a whole range of factors, and observations of the losses in particular vertebrate species have led to this being associated, this era, with what's called a sixth mass extinction. Indeed, no taxonomic groups are safe from the ravages of our activities. And even when the species themselves are not an immediate threat of global extinction, their decline in biomass globally is generally going to be associated with disappearances from particular areas. The loss of biodiversity at such a massive scale already is having and will in the future have drastic effects on the nature and functioning of ecosystems, and therefore on the services that we derive from them. Nature is not a random collection, but it's rather associations that engage in competition, exploitation, cooperation. Ecological communities are emergent assemblages of the evolution of individual species, in the same way that human societies emerge in the sense of Adam Smith. If we lost a few physicians or bakers or carpenters from our large cities, we could probably survive because others would take up the slack. But there'd be a cost. There'd be a cost in the loss of our adaptive capacity. But the more we lose, the more we're at risk. And we start to see the effect of that in the community, in increased difficulty getting to see your doctor, even in a big city, the medical specialist you need. Well, ecological communities are similar. They have emergent characteristics, including the cycling of nutrients to sustain functioning. So if we lose a few species, like we lost the American chestnut in the forest around here, perhaps the system doesn't change much, but our insurance has been eroded. Biodiversity is important in any communities. Tillman and Downing, in a long-term experiment in Minnesota grasslands, showed that in response to a major drought, the most diverse communities were the most robust in terms of maintaining biomass and productivity. For the same reasons that evolution has developed mechanisms like mutation and sexual recombination to generate variation, that variation is important in providing adaptive capacity from which better candidates can be selected to exploit changing environments more efficiently. The system has built in not only variation, but a kind of functional redundancy, and both are essential for maintaining robustness and resilience. Biodiversity is a broad source of services to humanity. In addition, even in the absence of immediate benefits, it provides a kind of insurance against the loss of essential services. Individual species, like the American chestnut, may be lost to be replaced by others that fill a similar role. However, one can only go to the bank just so often to get these replacements. Each time a species or genotype is lost and replaced, some of the natural capital that provides the system with adaptive capacity is lost. If ecosystems were individually and privately owned, the owners would have incentive to preserve this adaptive capacity. In general, however, the adaptive capacity is a public good, or maybe a common pool resource, beneficial to all, but not sufficiently so to offset the individual incentives to overexploit. Fisheries and forests are under open access, and this provides striking examples of what Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons, building on concepts from William Foster Lloyd. And you'll be familiar as economists with Hardin's solution to the problem, which was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, with a large role for top-down control. But it was left to our late colleague, the Nobelist Eleanor Ostrom, to show how such mutual agreement could arise from the bottom up. While the primary units of evolution are at levels well below that of whole systems, housed in individual genomes and tight coevolutionary relationships, there's no reason to believe that the mechanisms of evolution will preserve the services that maintain a habitat for humanity, or even the general macroscopic properties of the ecosystems we know. We need to look no further than what we're doing to our planet, in particular in eroding biodiversity and its adaptive capacitance to stop the bleeding. So we have to stop the bleeding. We first of all have an education problem. We need to get across the message that we're losing biodiversity, and it matters. It matters for the direct benefits, and it matters for the insurance that the adaptive capacity provides. So all species are important, but some are more important than others because they provide these services to us, directly or indirectly. For example, by sustaining the ecosystem structure and functioning. So that brings me to the closing comments. We need to find ways to solve this problem. We need to end perverse subsidies. We need to replace a simple measure of GDP with the measure, like I laid out, of inclusive wealth, taking into account the cost to natures. Rich importing countries have to stop exploiting their ecological footprint. Among net importers of primary products, 45% of their footprint is linked to those imports. This was reported in the paper that Dasgupta and I recently published. We need to teach that we're in a coordination game where we can all benefit from the maintenance of a crucial public good. We need collective intelligence and collective action. Obviously, we have to work to convince our fellow citizens. We have to convince politicians. But as this paper lays out with Martin Rees and Anya Levina, we also need to work with businesses which have a real interest in sustainability. We need to work together with all elements of society. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you. I've stopped. Somebody else going to take over now.
can't see me. David.
I hear you, but there's quite a bad echo.
We know.
Do you still have the echo?
Not when you talk, David.
Okay, so I think Chris is asking me to continue. I'm David Cooper, the Acting Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And building on what Simon was just saying, I think we can conclude really that the ongoing loss of biodiversity threatens our development, threatens sustainable development. Perhaps it threatens our existence as a civilization on this planet, and it certainly jeopardizes achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We've seen, I think, in recent months and over the past few years, increasing prevalence of natural disasters, heat waves, floods, droughts, forest fires, and the like. And of course, these are largely attributed to climate change. And indeed, climate change is increasing the risk and severity of all of these events. But also ecosystem degradation, the loss of biodiversity, is also increasing the risk of these events. These two factors, biodiversity loss and climate change, in fact, are working in tandem, and together really do constitute an existential crisis for humanity. And on top of that, of course, biodiversity is essential for all the reasons Simon has just described. It underpins the functioning of healthy ecosystems that provide essential services, including clean water, including food, and it also underpins many functioning of ecosystems at the planetary scale that maintains a livable planet, let us say. So to address this issue, governments and all stakeholders have come together under the Convention on Biological Diversity and adopted last December the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This was agreed in Montreal after a number of years of negotiation. And Elizabeth Marema, in her message a little while ago, outlined many of the features of this new framework. It aims to put us on a path to reach this vision of living in harmony with nature, and it translates that vision into four more tangible outcome-oriented goals for 2050. One focusing on biodiversity itself in all its dimensions, species, ecosystems, and genetic diversity. For example, to cut the extinction rate by at least an order of magnitude, and to reverse the loss of intact ecosystems and maintain genetic diversity. It also includes a second goal on maintaining those ecosystem services that Simon was talking about through sustainable use. And then there are two other goals, one on the sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources, and one on mobilizing the resources we need to implement this framework, financial and otherwise, closing the finance gap that we have. And then to get there, to put us on this path of recovery by 2030, there are 23 action-oriented targets, and Elizabeth mentioned some of them in her presentation a little while ago. The most well-known of these targets is the so-called 30 by 30 target to protect by 2030 at least 30% of lands, freshwaters and seas through protected areas or similar measures. And this is indeed an important target, but it's only one of 23 targets. There are others that are addressing all of the major drivers of biodiversity loss. So that's land use change, it's overexploitation, overfishing, overhunting, and so on. It's climate change, it's invasive alien species and pollution. And beyond that, the framework also includes a number of targets to really address some of the underlying drivers, and building again on what Simon was just concluding as some of the main areas where action is needed. There are, for example, a specific target to take note and integrate all the values of biodiversity in national accounting exercises and in all national policy making, to reform harmful subsidies, or to cut harmful subsidies or reform them so they're no longer harmful to biodiversity. And there's a specific target to reduce harmful subsidies, in fact, by at least $500 billion a year. Currently, most countries and the world as a whole spends far more on activities that destroy biodiversity than on activities that protect it. That has to change. And there's another target specifically directed at businesses, to get businesses to figure out their dependencies on biodiversity, but also their impacts on biodiversity, so that those impacts can be progressively reduced. And this for two purposes, if you like. One, a self-interested purpose to reduce the risk to businesses themselves from the loss of ecosystem services, from the risk of ecosystem collapse, from the risk of their supply chains being affected, but also to look at the broader risk to nature and to people, beyond the risk to businesses themselves. There are also targets for mobilizing the resources that we need more generally to support all countries, but particularly developing countries, to meet these ambitious targets. So there's a target to raise 200 billion per year from all sources, and within that, one for developed countries to provide to developing countries at least $20 billion per year by 2025, so very short term, and 30 billion by 2030. So there's a whole range of targets. What will be necessary to achieve this ambitious framework will be the engagement of everyone. Elizabeth emphasized this. Simon mentioned the need for a whole of society approach. We need to work across all sectors of government. The role of indigenous peoples and local communities, who steward at the moment lands where that are in much better shape for biodiversity, and their traditional lands contain, as the science has showed, much higher levels of biodiversity in general. The full engagement of indigenous peoples and local communities will be key. And underpinning that is the importance of protecting their rights, and in fact a broader human rights-based approach, including the right for a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. I think I've used my 10 minutes, so I'll hand back to Chris.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll start. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for fixing the echo. I'll be mindful of my time, but it's a pleasure to be here with everybody today, and thank you for traveling from so far to accompany us in this important event. My name is Carolina. I work in Conservation International, and it's been very nice to hear both Simon and David and a few of the other panelists in the opening discussions mention this integrated approach that we need to be able to really address the biodiversity loss that we're seeing globally. And I think that's where I'll kind of focus my intervention today. And so first of all, we need to be ambitious, we need to be dedicated, and we need to collaborate across all sectors to be able to address these issues. That means nonprofit organizations working with for-profit businesses and enterprises. It means local and national governments working with civil society and academia. And it also means really integrating, and I think David mentioned this towards the end of his presentation, it really means integrating effectively and actively Indigenous peoples and local communities in policy development and policy implementation. And we can't have the impact that we want on biodiversity if we don't really focus our work on working with Indigenous peoples and local communities. IPLCs, which are Indigenous people and local communities, are only 5% of global population, but they're stewarding more than a quarter of the world's land. And more than anything, and for the purposes of this conference, they are supporting and living in places where we have 80% of the world's biodiversity. So I think that's something that we really need to hone in on if we want to address biodiversity loss globally. And to do that, we can't just focus on the environmental aspects of this. And I know that a lot of biologists and ecologists and we have our hearts, well, I'm not a biologist, I'm more focused on social sciences, but biodiversity is key, but we have to look at all of the elements that are integrated into conserving biodiversity and the people that are really living and that are most affected by biodiversity loss. And so to do that, what we really need is to focus on good governance, which includes working with national and subnational governments on developing these policies, kind of this top-down approach. But also we need to work on linking those policies to local territorial planning. And whenever we're talking about Indigenous peoples, we're talking about life plans, as we call them here in Ecuador. It's these development plans that communities have where they prioritize their needs, not just focused on the environment, but also looking at health, education, and other social issues and economy, and based on their priorities and their needs on the ground. So how can we link this governance from the national level, from subnational local governments to Indigenous governance on the ground? We also need to have ambitious conservation and restoration goals. And we can't do that without taking into consideration sustainable production. And I know some people have already mentioned this, but we need to have production that is not only deforestation free and contributes to restoring our ecosystems, these nature positive solutions, but that also contribute to the livelihoods of the people that really depend on these ecosystems on the ground and then in the cities that are surrounding those areas, right? And so to give, I think to give a more tangible example of what this might look like on the ground, at Conservation International, we're implementing a program called the Amazon Indigenous Women's Fellowship Program. And it's wonderful to see that the French government is supporting this event because they're also supporting that initiative. And we're providing fellowships to Indigenous women who propose or present their proposals, projects related to natural resource conservation to benefit their communities, to improve and improve their leadership skills in their communities, and how all of that is linked to conservation and to cultural identity and to ancestral knowledge, and how that can be linked and contribute to enhancing scientific Western knowledge that we use in different universities. And so as part of that initiative, which we're implementing in 7 countries and in Ecuador in particular, especially in the central Amazon region and the northern Amazon region, we have women like Yadira, who is from the Siecopay nationality, who is working with her community on rescuing and the use of the traditional clay and ceramics, not just as a mechanism to sell and have handicrafts as a bioeconomy initiative, but also to really restore that ancestral knowledge and that culture that's being lost, because there are shifting dynamics in indigenous communities as well. We're working with women like Kati Watatoka, who's from the Quichua community in the central Amazon region, who is living in a community that is already on the borders of an expanding city in the Amazon. So their culture, their context is completely shifting. There's more plastics that's being introduced into her community. And so she's working with other women to rescue the use of ancestral medicinal plants and how that can be complemented by Western medicine, but not lost. And so we're seeing how really all of these leadership skills, how governance and how human well-being is central and integral to the conservation of biodiversity and our ecosystems. And I think that part of the work that we have to do here and part of the work that we have to do these next 2 days is how can we reach out to different sectors that aren't just the environmental sector, that we need to reach out to the tech industry, we need to reach out to the fashion industry, we need to really reach across and have these tangible, collaborative agreements to be able to support these communities that are stewarding the remaining forests and the biodiversity that we have globally. And I think with the pandemic, and as we're seeing now, we have more virtual interaction, in-person interaction, but with the pandemic, we really see that the environment and conservation and biodiversity aren't just an environmental issue. They are really intrinsically linked to health, to education, to economies, and so many other issues that really need to be addressed in order for us to continue to conserve biodiversity. And I think I might end a little bit early. I don't know if that way we can have more discussion. Yeah.
You get brownie points for that, right?
Okay.
For later. Thomas, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will try to get my slides up.
We have a sound issue. Just a minute. We'll swip. I guess we're going to flip the sound back to Zoom. 1 sec. We can't hear you. At least.
Did you hear me now, or is the Is the sound okay?
It's okay now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's a pity I can't be in Quito with you. I also want to thank Carolina, Simon, and David for putting a very excellent foundation for some of ideas and reflections I will present in the next 10 minutes, which actually is about one of the central concepts for the conference, nature positive development, and what are the dimensions of that. I would relate that to Nature Futures framework, which I think could be quite useful in getting a deeper understanding of what nature positive actually means. So one interpretation the organization Global Goal for Nature have made of nature positive is that it's not only decreasing or halting the loss of biodiversity. There is an inflection point by 2030 where there is actually an increase in biodiversity over time, which mainly will be based on very ambitious restoration projects in many different parts of the world, not the least in the global south. But this is not, there are a lot of challenges with restoration, particularly in a world that is very, very crowded. And I think that this graph really illustrates how crowded the world is and how human dominated, that wild mammals only constitute 4% of the total biomass of mammals on the planet. So it's crowded, and restoration will therefore have many, many challenges which we need to overcome. And one, of course, is how we could learn to coexist with biodiversity. And that would be would need a lot of innovation and creativity, particularly also in governance. One study we did a couple of years ago, Nature in the Urban Century, pointed out that in 2 decades, due to rapid urban growth, particularly in the global south, 40% of the world's protected area will essentially be urban parks, which means that these protected areas will be adjacent to urban areas or actually completely surrounded by human settlements. So this is, again, emphasize strongly the need for, we need to learn to live with and coexist with biodiversity. And we will have a very steep learning curve in doing that. In Europe, there are, I think, a lot of interesting and creative and innovative projects on the way, particularly as part of this new, very new nature restoration law that also include, very importantly, peri-urban and urban areas, and engaging urban citizens in restoration projects. Similarly, Rewilding Europe is engaged in large-scale restoration projects, also to some degree then including peri-urban areas. And I think these restoration projects could be guided by this Nature Futures framework, which recently was published and has been part of an IPBES working group developing the framework. Mansour et al. Published one interpretation of this, that this Nature Futures framework will have 3 dimensions. One is nature for nature, and another is nature for society, and the third one is nature as culture. And I think this, in a way, very elegantly interlink 3 very important dimensions of biodiversity, and would help in mainstreaming biodiversity, for example, in planning, urban planning and regional development. So nature for nature would represent then intrinsic values of biodiversity, where rewilding areas would be one example of how you could increase nature for nature and support biodiversity. Nature for society will represent the utilitarian values, and all examples we have on nature-based solutions and how we are using vegetation and biodiversity for generating ecosystem services that will regulate, for example, temperature or water flow in the landscape and other ecosystem services. And the third one, nature as culture, which would then emphasize relational values, the cultural dimension of biodiversity, which could be manifested and are manifested in many ways in parks and botanical gardens, but also urban agriculture and all sorts of other examples. And if you look around, I think it's really encouraging to see that people all around the world are engaging in developing festivals around biodiversity to highlight the cultural dimension, and also to integrate art into all the strategic plans for maintaining and protecting biodiversity. So I think this framework has some really important dimensions that would help in our struggle to learn how to coexist with biodiversity and with nature. And also, you can take an example, it could be used for scenarios, trying to see where we are and where we want to go. So most areas might be focusing on the utilitarian nature for society values, but the other dimensions are also really important and be part of urban and regional planning. And they all will need to be based in people, knowledge, and management. And just to give you some encouraging examples that to this date in 2023, more than 1,300 demonstration projects on nature-based solutions and rewilding has been initiated in throughout Europe. And I think this represents a lot of very interesting experiments in how we could be better and learn how to live with and coexist with biodiversity. And with that, I will thank you very much.
Thank you very
And
much,
hand over to you.
Thomas. Thank you very, very much for that. Last but not least, Vanessa. Is she online? I don't see her online, actually.
Her icon is there.
Yes, can you hear me?
Ah, yes, okay, great. Okay, we can't see you, but we can hear you.
Yes.
There we go, we got you. Perfect, thank you. You have the floor.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. So good afternoon to everyone, and thank you to GDN for inviting me and the African Development Bank to this very important discussion. I've listened to the keynote speaker, Elizabeth Nrima, a very inspirational woman, I must say, and previous speakers talking about what we all refer to as the crisis of nature. So we've had different perspectives on solutions, just looking at the scale of this global crisis. And today my message is about value. That this is actually a crisis about value, our misunderstanding of nature's value, and that the fundamental misalignment of how we appreciate nature's vast and extensive values is driving misuse of biodiversity and natural resources. And so to address this crisis, we first of all have to go back to the basics, which is, what is nature to us? How can we address the issue of undervaluing nature's assets or natural assets? What are the solutions? Financing mechanisms, technologies, partnerships. Because we talk about innovation, but we need to be very practical about what is needed. So I think the theme of this conference on biodiversity and sustainable development is very timely from the GDN network. And it feeds into the momentum we've seen, as we've heard from the CBD Secretariat, from COP15 and what must be done to implement coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So let me share some thoughts on how the AFDB is approaching the question of natural capital and biodiversity loss. So we heard those the statistics on the scale of this global crisis and how important nature and natural capital is to the global economy. We know that natural capital and ecosystem services sustain all life on the planet. But we've seen that nature and its critical values are not fully accounted for in our economic systems. And yet more than half of the world's GDP, about $44 trillion, is at immediate risk from nature loss because of the high dependency on nature. And nature dependency is not homogeneous. What we can see is variations in how economies are depending on nature. So we've come up with two broad categories of nature dependency. One is nature reliance, and the other is nature resilience. And the distinction between nature reliance and nature resilience is in value. So on the first hand, nature reliance is a situation where you have a high nature dependency and a low localization of nature's values. And this could be economic, social, or environmental values. So how the countries now become more resilient or nature resilient They do this by increasingly measuring and accounting for the values of natural capital and biodiversity and localizing these values in their economies. And this can be done, for instance, by monetizing carbon sequestration assets you have in forest-rich regions in Africa, or even building green industries from critical minerals, like what we see driving the clean energy transition. So the AFDB's African Economic Outlook for this year has estimated that 62% of Africa's GDP is dependent on natural resources and essential ecosystem services. On the other hand, exports are mainly primary commodities. So we see this contradiction, which I was referring to on value, and it's showing that Africa is nature reliant. And this natural capital wealth is composed mainly of land and renewable natural capital. And it's over 70% of Africa's total natural capital wealth. So the management and use of renewable natural assets, especially land, is very critical to building Africa's future resilience, not just to biodiversity loss, but to climate change and to sustainable development and inclusive governance of all its communities and peoples. We talk about the global crisis of the commons, climate change, biodiversity loss, and the degradation of nature. And it's clear that how land and renewable resources are managed in Africa is critical to really addressing these challenges. So therefore, you could say that as its largest source of wealth, there's a strong incentive for Africa to have full knowledge of the values of the stock of its natural capital. But this is only possible if we can generate the data, statistics, and information on these natural capital values. And how can this be done? So we know, of course, that we can measure natural capital and ecosystem services values using standardized methods on accounting and assessment and valuation of ecosystem services and of natural capital. And this now helps us to better understand the scale and contribution of nature to Africa's economies and how nature-related risks can be better integrated, not just in economies, but in finance, urban development, infrastructure development as well, so that we can build more resilient economies in Africa. And I think overall, it helps us to address the puzzle I mentioned before, which is that if nature is so important, why don't we treat it differently? Why don't we all recognize the values of nature? So there is a knowledge gap. And for Africa, which has most of its wealth concentrated in natural capital, there's a huge incentive to try and build more knowledge and to close that gap on the values of nature. And this will underlie or underpin what we call nature transformative or nature positive pathways for development. So a few practical examples of how the AFDB has approached this question. First of all, we have a new framework called Natural Resources Management and Investment Action Plan, which will be running for 4 years from next year, 2024, up to 2028. And this plan has at its core valuing natural capital as a foundation. And through this, we intend to increase our support to African countries to increasingly value and measure their natural assets, to generate information, data, statistics, not just for national accounts, but also to underpin investment flows, new financial flows, and to leverage these natural assets to build more green and inclusive economies. We've also introduced several projects and interventions, namely our project with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, which seeks to mainstream natural capital in development finance. We've also had a series of partnerships with WWF and other global actors, for instance, with the Africa Ecological Futures Project, which is a futures and innovative way of thinking about planning, ecological planning, and integrated resource planning. We've done some work as well in advising countries on debt for nature swaps and how these could be used to mobilize climate finance and finance for biodiversity conservation. We've also raised our ambition on nature. The AFDB is financing Africa's largest project on restoring nature, the Great Green Wall Initiative, in 11 Sahelian countries. And so far, we've mobilized $16 billion through an accelerator program, We've also tried to introduce an accelerator through a climate action window for African countries in order to scale access to climate finance for low-income and fragile countries over the next 2 years. And of course, we deeply support global commitments such as the NDB's Joint Nature Pledge, and then of course, funding Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We see this as a call to action for nature policy development in Africa. And we recognize that biodiversity is an important contributor to sustainable development in all the global treaties. So in conclusion, as I said, Africa has vast natural capital, and it's unique in the sense that this is the continent's greatest form of wealth currently. So what does natural capital accounting, what does valuing natural capital and ecosystem services do for Africa? It gives us a better appreciation of the values of these natural assets. It incentivizes responsible use, protection, and conservation of these assets, and also using them to generate sustainable investments. And I think this supports the whole essence of how we can transition from countries being more nature reliant to being nature resilient. And we welcome new models of innovation, investment, and finance to support building these types of resilient economies, which are so critical to addressing biodiversity loss in Africa and elsewhere. So finally, in conclusion, I want to thank the organizers for inviting the AFDB to this conversation. It's very timely. A lot of insights have been shared. I'm looking forward to learning more and engaging over the next few days. And I think this is a very critical moment for the world. We have to come together in unity to see how we can protect and restore nature for all of humanity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for those and for sticking to basically to our time. So in my role as chair, let me impose some structure on this. You may disagree with the structure, but you know I had to see what you guys were going to say. So so let me impose some structure on this, and to try to sort of wrestle this all into so. What we're doing here, I mean, there are various objects of study. So let's sort of take this sort of from the social science standpoint. There are various objects of study, and Thomas's, in some sense, the nature, society, and culture, you know, trichotomy that sort of gives us, in some sense, sort of the objects of study with more detailed objects of study such as Indigenous populations, or as a Canadian, as I would call them, First Nations, or gender, you know, various ways we can slice and dice the object of study, okay? And then we're trying to get somewhere. Okay? I'm an economist, I can't hide it, right? So we have an objective function somewhere that we're trying to get to. And, you know, how can I not enjoy hearing Simon talking about, you know, a Journal of Economic Perspectives paper, because that was a very good read, that paper, that 2004 paper. But the point is here, this is something which is in some sense unfamiliar to economists. It's something that physicists are very much aware of. I work a lot with physicists. Physicists are aware of sort of this concept in some sense of optimal noise, the optimal level of noise, right? It's sort of like there's a typical physics problem in terms of you know, stochastic differential equations, where you're trying to you have a road and you have cars turning into that main road, and mathematicians know very well that if you increase the variance of the traffic on the main road, you can get more cars turning in from the side road. Okay, so in most of life, you know, whether it's with our stereo or our telephones, we want to get rid of noise. But biodiversity is one of these examples where noise is good, right? Noise, or again, to use sort of economics speak, Rothschild and Stiglitz type increasing risk is something which is good. So that's where we're trying to get to. And the problem is that our objective function, basically, there's a huge, you know, to sort of put it in the sort of the most basic economic terms, there's a huge deviation between the social objective function and the individual objective function. So for economists, this is the standard, you know, standard externality problem. And then and this is what I'd like you guys, if possible, to focus on. We're trying to find the mechanisms which get us from these objects of study to where we want to go. And in terms of the interventions today, the 5 people who've spoken, I'm going to break these down into 4 categories of mechanisms to get us from here to there. So first is targets, and let me be provocative here also to get you mad, so that you really go at it. So how useful are targets? I ask this simply because I'm old enough to remember the old Soviet Union, and the whole Soviet economy was predicated on targets. And elsewhere, I've tried to be provocative and say that what we need actually is a non-proliferation treaty in terms of targets. Because if you look at the SDGs, there'll probably be some UN people in the room who will want to stab me afterwards. But if you look at the SDGs, there are 169 targets, and I just checked. It used to be 264 indicators. Now they're 267 indicators, of which 92 are environmental, right? And how can you make policy with 92 targets? So I'm not attacking David here because he was talking about different types of targets, right? Like financing targets and things like that. But how useful are targets? I mean, it's basically, for an economist, it's prices versus quantities, right? And these are quantitative targets. So think of Gosplan. Second mechanism is prices, right? So if we were, or if I was, or people in the audience, thank God we're not. If we were, University of Chicago economists, to the right of Attila the Hun, we basically believe that we could solve all problems by, getting the prices right, right? And of course, that of course is, for a University of Chicago economist, which I am not. I'm an MIT. I come from MIT, so not University of Chicago. So I'm saltwater, not freshwater. This is an optimal taxation problem, but prices. And there we've heard about prices also in terms of asset classes from Vanessa, right? And pricing carbon sequestration. The third mechanism. So targets, prices, or creating asset classes. Thirds, excuse me. I'd call it advocacy or moral suasion. Okay, and that in some sense is what Carolina was talking about. It's advocacy, moral suasion, and picking your targets right. What sectors do you go after? And then the fourth mechanism that I'd like you to say something about has to do with Elinor Ostrom, and has to do with, well, not just her, but given that you brought her up, collective action and coordination games. And it strikes me also that there's a lot of positive feedback loops between when you're talking about indigenous populations and coordination games, right? I mean, there's a larger anthropological literature on this. Anyway, so those are the 4 mechanisms I saw. So I may be, as one says in French, complètement à côté de la plaque, but that's what I got from you guys. And what I'd like to ask you to do now, again, these were the rules of the game. Each of you, in the same order as we did before, a couple of minutes, sort of seeing what your take is on this. That I'd really appreciate that, and I think most people in the audience might be interested in hearing that. I mean, they may disagree completely with the way I sliced and diced it, but hey, I'm the chair, so I get to do this, right? That's why I get paid the big bucks, right? The floor is yours, starting with Simon.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. I don't have a neatly packaged answer to your questions, and some of these ideas are in a paper that Partha and I recently published. But I wanted to respond to the points you made. First of all, the point about optimal noise, that's a great point. In evolution, the rate at which evolution proceeds is determined by 2 factors: the selection coefficients, but also the degree of variation in the population. We need to maintain some degree of diversity and variation in order that the selection has something to act on. And so mutation and sexual recombination, as I mentioned, have actually been selected for and arisen. So we have to that's one of the reasons we have to maintain diversity. And I think it's a great question as to how much diversity you need, and that will depend upon the rate at which things are changing. That's a research question. Secondly, one thing you didn't mention, which I think is extremely important here, is discounting. What discount rate do we use, both for the future? And as you know, there's a lot of debate on that point, going from Nick Stern's report to a great paper that Marty Weitzman put together, and other interpretations as to whether we should use 3%, 1.5%, 0%, or maybe some negative rate. And discounting refers not only to the temporal discounting with the potential for hyperbolic discounting, but discounting of the interests of others. which then brings me to the question of prosociality, the degree to which individuals should care, do care about others, and how do we get them to incorporate more of a care for us in their own utility functions. And I've been working on that for about a decade with Avinash Dixit, a great economist who's turned interest in this direction. And that leads, as you said, to a recognition that we're not dealing with prisoners' dilemmas. We're dealing with coordination games in which there's interest in getting people to work together in a collective good, in which is why I said we need collective intelligence and collective action, in which people recognize that by working it's not a zero-sum game, that your benefit may be my benefit. And finally, you mentioned getting the prices right. There's a point that Ken Arrow, of course, often made, which is the reason the markets aren't sufficient to deal with these problems is because the social costs, the externalities, are not included in the market prices. So, so those are my responses to the various points you raised, plus the one more about discounting.
I know it is. And thank you for bringing up discounting. And I mean, if I get to vote, I'd say 0, but you know, I'm old-fashioned in terms of the discount rate. And thank you also for raising the hyperbolic discount. For those of you who don't know what hyperbolic discounting is, it's basically sort of there's individuals have human beings, basically today and tomorrow is one thing, and then from tomorrow to after tomorrow is discounted differently. Okay, so for the non-economists in the room, if you look up hyperbolic discounting, that's what you're going to find.
Can I comment on your point?
Go right ahead, please.
Yeah,
and then plus it's David speaking, right?
Oh, it's Simon.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. Oh, go right ahead. No, Simon, go right ahead.
No, and your point about zero discounting. I mean, one could even make a case for negative discounting, given that if populations are going to continue to increase. But the difficulty with that is if you're dealing with a non-renewable resource, then the logic says that I can't use any in order that you can't use any. So, so uncertainty about the future probably has to introduce some sort of discount rate, or else we wouldn't be able to use non-renewable resources at all. Maybe we shouldn't.
Thank you. Point taken. David.
Well, certainly we have to phase out using one class of non-renewable resources, right? That's fossil fuels. And just on that point, but I think, yeah, diversity, the importance of diversity, obviously, as Simon's emphasized, the importance of biodiversity, including genetic diversity. But we also need to look at diversity of worldviews and perhaps of ways people look at values. And I think Thomas outlined the Nature Futures framework, which provides some framework for that. And he mentioned IPBES, the IPCC for biodiversity, if you like. And IPBES has also just over a year ago produced an assessment on values, looking at the diverse values of nature and how and different valuation methods. And beyond the way that most economists will do that. So, you know, what you've been discussing is extremely important and useful. It finds its place in the Kunming-Montreal framework, for instance, with respect to looking at how businesses may act and interact with this new framework, as I mentioned before. But we also need to be looking at other worldviews, other ways people look at the world, and particularly those of indigenous peoples, which will not necessarily reduce things in the same way. Collective action certainly important. I think our big challenge. I mean, we know roughly what needs to be done for biodiversity, to address biodiversity loss, climate change in the aggregate, cumulatively at the global level. We know what needs to be done. Getting that to be done in a way that is just and democratic from the bottom up is the challenge. Targets, are they useful? They're useful, I think, in providing a sense, helping to sort of describe that sense of common purpose that we have, but they are only targets. And so people were very happy to adopt the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in December. It's an ambitious framework. It took a lot of negotiation to get there, but that's the easy part, right? The difficult part is now translating that agreement into action. And I think, maybe the one aspect you didn't mention, Chris, just now is power relations, right? Who controls these markets? Markets don't exist in a vacuum. Rules are created for them to work. Property rights, tangible and intellectual, and then those shaping those rules are often powerful vested interests. So we will need to confront those vested interests, as was clearly set out in the 2019 IPBES global assessment. That's not easy, but obviously we have to look at those challenges.
Now, yes. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. So let me take off my sort of anti-target hat and put my pro-target hat on. I thought you were going to come back by saying, well, it could help with the coordination mechanism, because that's what I see the targets as being. I don't know, some of you may be aware there's this old literature in economics in the 1990s where people were looking at sunspot equilibria. So if people could coordinate on sunspots, some kind of verifiable and observable, to all. And then the sort of the game theory literature also common targets can actually move the Schmilblick forward. Carolina.
Yep. Thanks. Great questions. With regards, to picking up on the targets question, I completely agree. And while I do think we're very ambitious in setting too many targets, I think they are necessary. I think as humans, we need a goal and a target to move towards. Otherwise, we're just going to stay stagnant or meet status quo and not have something to work towards. And I think it definitely does support in this coordination mechanism and helping to align people and organizations from different sectors towards a common goal. But with respect to that, I also think that there is a challenge, and especially if we're thinking about, for example, EU policy, where we're trying to decrease the importation of deforestation, how that collective target from the demand side also has a very real burden on the global South as well in meeting those targets and that collective action. So how can we establish these targets in a way that we're not just dumping the burden on the countries that have existing biodiversity, but how can we support them in meeting those targets? With regards to prices and establishing the right price, I think that's always a challenge. I'm not an economist, so I won't get into any of the discounting discussions, but I do think that whenever we are establishing targets, first of all, or prices, we can't just talk about the price of carbon, because carbon doesn't work in a vacuum in the forest. We have to think about all of the co-benefits and all of the elements that are intrinsically aligned in that forest, and that includes the people that depend on those forests. With regards to advocacy and moral suasion, I think it's a fundamental part of the work that we're doing, and I think it influences policy design and implementation. I think it supports in really elevating and amplifying the voices of those who perhaps don't have a seat at the table whenever we're discussing with policy makers and decision makers, and how can we use that as a tool to have a representative from an Indigenous community at the table with the government negotiating, and not having an organization like Conservation International or UNDP or somebody else speaking on behalf of them. So I think that's a fundamental element of what we do. And then, of course, I think collective action and coordination are I think we've discussed it several times. It's very much needed. It's essential for us to be able to have this integrated approach, this rights-based approach to addressing these issues. And there's definitely challenges in that because a lot of us are competing for the same resources, talking about NGOs in the environmental sector, but at the same time, we're partners and allies and we can collaborate. And whenever we do that effectively, I think we see real impact on the ground. So I think that's very important.
Thank you very much. And I like the sentence, carbon pricing does not operate in a vacuum, in honor of the French. I mean, President Macron found that out a few years ago in terms of the Gilets jaunes meeting, and where basically carbon pricing ran headlong into social issues and income distribution. Thomas, please.
Well, thank you. Well, yeah, I think you raised a number of very important issues. So just some reflections on how useful are targets and quantifiable targets. I believe they're useful as long as they're credible and transparent, and also, which I think is really, really important, that they're also social just, that there is justice and equity dimensions. And I think if they are, they could be very useful in mobilizing collective action. But I think where we are failing many times are with the social just dimension and the equity dimension. And then we will have a society that is split, and it's not sort of supportive, or there are conflicts around the targets. A reflection also on prices. I think there is a need overall for us to be much better in articulating values of nature, those values that can't be expressed in monetary terms, or perhaps shouldn't be expressed in monetary terms. But there are other ways we could articulate these values so they be part of societal conversation, and also the planning and development.
Thank you, Thomas. Vanessa.
So thank you so much to all the panelists. Very interesting comments from the chair as well. So just to respond to some of the issues that you tried to zoom in on, I think on targets, first of all, targets are a necessary evil if you think of them in that way, because certainly there has to be a goal we're working towards. If you talk about biodiversity loss, it's such a grave issue that certainly there's a need for that global coordination. And I think having these targets helps to really build that coordinated effort. But what I've seen and what we've seen from the MDB perspective is that countries are under increasing pressure to make choices between, for instance, focusing on achieving climate targets and sustainable development. So for instance, we've seen a decline in access to concessional finance for poor and fragile countries. And the terrain for financing is really very contested now. It's more difficult for countries to access finance, especially for grants, which have less risk. And many countries feel that they're being forced to adopt more targets with less resources in a highly constrained international environment. So I think targets are good in themselves, but globally there should be a conversation on how we are financing development. And that if we're encouraging the notion that there is a trade-off between, for instance, focusing on climate finance and development finance, because these should be integral. But if we see them as separate pieces of the puzzle, then first of all, we're not coordinated because resources are being fragmented, either between development or climate change. And then the countries themselves are under more pressure. So I think there's a need for more joined up thinking. For instance, if you look at climate action and biodiversity action, how can we be more integrated? It makes life easier for the countries. So from a very practical perspective, you see that there's increasing contestation from countries that they feel that they're being made to face very difficult choices on how they can finance climate change and also finance their long-term development. And that there's a need for more clarity on how countries can really be given the right level of support and how we as practitioners can be coordinated in putting targets in place which are realistic and aligned to these countries' long-term development. So that's the first point I wanted to highlight. And then on pricing, there's a lot of awareness now that economics and finance needs to think differently about nature. What we've not seen is on the private sector side on how risk is priced. So most people say, oh, you know, biodiversity projects are only done by development finance institutions, and that the risk is extremely high for private investors to enter into this space. And I actually disagree with that. But the point is maybe a lack of awareness. And so there has to be more research, knowledge, and engagement between various sections of society, between the public and private sectors, governments, institutions, investors, and regulators who are actually governing the market space. I think that there's a whole new opportunity. When you say the nature economy, we saw from Thomas's presentation that there's new opportunities in this nature positive approach. And it's really about putting that on the table for the private sector to understand. So for me, it's not about a high risk, but it's about getting the business case right and getting the money on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've basically run out of time. I enjoyed the fact that it was Vanessa who was last, because in some sense, one thing that we haven't talked about is sort of how to reform the international financial architecture, which, you know, very modest goal. But this is stuff. Some of you may have been at the Macron summit in Paris in June. I was, and you know that's what the international sort of community is talking about. Maybe Jerry de la Paulera in Plenary B can give us some words of wisdom concerning that topic. Let me just leave you with a nice phrase. So many years ago, many years ago, when I was an undergraduate, I remember a book that sort of blew me out of the water when I first read it, and that was Arthur Oken, and it was equity versus efficiency, and it was, you know, equity versus efficiency, and it says the big trade-off. And then the question is, do we really, when it comes to biodiversity, do we really have a trade-off between equity and efficiency? You know, some of you have mentioned, rightly so, you know, power relations, which are extremely important. That is something which conditions enormously the equity side. I'd prefer, if you would allow me to wear rose-tinted lenses, to think that equity and efficiency often go hand in hand, and I'll leave you with that positive thought. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Simon. Thank you to David. Thank you to Carolina. Thank you to Thomas. Thank you to Vanessa for and obeying the rules. I really appreciate that. So talk about, you know, rules-based international system. You were very easy to manage, and I thank you for that. And please, the audience, give them a big hand.